half, Mr. McCahey studied the American pop cultural art form of stripping. His sociological inquisition took him all across the country and found him rubbing elbows with such notables as Patty Wagon, Terry and Her Privates, and one of his very favorites, Chili Pepper. His research has culminated in a variety of books, articles, and presentations. Mr. McCahey's research has dealt only with professional strippers. So in order to further broaden his studies, and also mine, the committee is going to try to give him a look at amateur night at the Peanut Tree tonight. So we're hoping that... Will you all please welcome Charles McCahey.
Thank you very much. Obviously, studying strippers, just as you study anything else, you have to come equipped to study whatever your particular area is. And this is part of my equipment. You see, I didn't really want it that way, but that's the way it happened. You've got to have this sort of thing. You can't be Donny Osmond, in other words, and really make a big hit with the strippers. There's sort of a resurgence in William Blake's literature, and I suppose I might as well start off with one of his quotes. He says that the nakedness of woman is the work of God. And many theatrical historians feel that perhaps the striptease is the single contribution of the American theater to theatrical innovations. As it turns out, I think there is one other, and that is the blackface. And this is sort of a, I don't know whether these are compliments or not, but persons have called the striptease the American native dance. I think in order to understand what striptease is all about, you can only understand it in the context of burlesque. And to start at the very, very beginning, burlesque seemed to have originated way back in the 5th century BC with Aristophanes. Burlesque was a form of parody, a spoof, devised gags, wisecracks, and perhaps Aristophanes was the one to introduce seduction as part of entertainment. It was an appeal to the lowest common denominator. It was an appeal to the common man. Now, American burlesque is a direct descendant of the English burlesque, and the first recorded English burlesque occurred in 1600. It was entitled The Most Lamentable Comedy and Most Cruel Death of Pyramus and Thisbe. Now, this was a takeoff on Midsummer Night's Dream. And perhaps some of you have heard of Gay's Beggar's Opera in 1728, and this was really the first burlesque that incorporated music and songs. And later on, England began to have the so-called extravaganzas, which were somewhat stressed sex, but essentially were spoofs of the classic literature, grand opera, or whatever popular plays happened to be playing in London at the time. And I think all of you who have ever been to college realize that you sometime along the line you have seen a spoof of Swan Lake. I even participated in one of those things myself, where we had football linemen as the swans dancing, and we had, of course, a gay fellow, literally and figuratively, who performed in the role of the prince or whatever he was. Well, this is burlesque in its real pure theatrical sense. Now, the first legitimate burlesque to arrive in the United States was in 1828 with Hamlet, not the Hamlet that you know, but this was a burlesque and was an import. Now, sex really didn't rear its head until about 1847, when we began to get this kind of a situation here. We began to get what were known as tableaux vivants, or living models. These girls would pose in the form of classic sculpture. On the stage, the curtain would open, and boom, there they were. And they had very pompous kinds of names like the Three Graces, Adam's First View of Eve. It was all very serious, you see. And the girls were, as you can see, decked out in tights, completely their hands were nude, but otherwise it's all very, very tastefully done. As a matter of fact, that was the first real burlesque that I ever saw. Not this far back, ladies and gentlemen, but the first burlesque I saw was at the Chippewa County Fair in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, where the hawker had brought me in, and they opened the curtains, and there was the Bride of Tomorrow. And she was dressed in a bridal veil and a bikini, you know, and then the curtain closed. But that's the first, and I thought, this is for me, you know. Well, by 1861, the notion of the female forms had really become an integral part of burlesque. There was an Ida Azix Menken, and we will show you her. There she is. She was in a play which was based on Behrens' Mazeppa, and she was in tights and she was strapped to a horse in the play. And this meant that there was some movement going on, and of course from there on who knows what kind of sin was about to come. And she brought just a really instant fame to herself, as well as a host of imitators. But the real forerunner of American burlesque came in 1866. At least as far as Ada had been concerned, her nudity, in quotes here, was part of the plot. But in 1866, there was a melodrama called The Black Crook. It had lavish sets, it had demons in it, and there was a shadowy grottos. There was the good fairies and the bad fairies, I guess. But primarily it was a parade of females in tights. And there's part of the cast right there. This was, there we are. There's the Black Crook, in case you missed him. You can see that it looks kind of serious, but it really wasn't meant to be. This was the same show that they introduced the can-can to the United States, where really the only nudity, of course, was between the stockings and the panties. But the point was that it was really primarily a girl show. And the plot was so trite and so pompous that nobody really took it particularly seriously. And in 16 months, it made $650,000 worth of profit. Naturally, it spawned a number of imitators. Not surprisingly, one of the imitators was the White Crook, and believe it or not, crisscross my heart, Black Crook Jr. Well, things progressed, and by 1868, one Lydia Thompson from England brought over her British blondes. Is that in focus, or does that, it looks awful to me. Oh, there we go. Much better. This is Lydia. Again, she produced a spectacle of elaborate costumes. There were songs and dances and so on. Her British blondes reportedly all tipped the scales at about 150. They were not shy, retiring girls by any means. And in fact, this seems to be one of the interesting factors of stage beauty at this time. They wanted lots of it, lots of bulk. And the press was very much scandalized by what they saw. They wrote things like, of legs more or less padded and bosoms more or less uncovered. Well, that was the forerunner of what was to come for the next 20 or 30 years. There began to be all kinds of all-female shows. There were elephantine girls in tights who would prance around the stage. There was actually something called the Amazon March, where the girls would come out in their tights and also dressed in warrior costumes and stomp about on the stage. There was a fellow by the name of Billy Watson who had the Beef Trust, is what he called it, large girls. They began to have more and more of the can-can, the Oriental and, quote, dancing girls who had really never been east of Brooklyn. And all kinds of smutty jokes began to creep in. Now, there had been always this reference, of course, to sex and seduction and so on. But finally, they began to get down to the Pickles and Frankfurters types of jokes. And as a consequence, things began to get worse. There she is, 1893, Little Egypt, who I'm sure you've all heard of, who made a big splash at one of the world's fairs. Little Egypt was actually an Armenian girl, but she introduced to the United States the hoochie coochie, which was a belly dance, which didn't originate in Egypt at all, but originated in the Balkans. Naturally, she was followed by a little Africa. You know, things you don't keep a monopoly on this stuff very long. And there was Salome dancing and, of course, Venus dancing. And essentially, the hooch began to become standard in all the shows. She was a very, very great success. She's really a dashing creature, isn't she? Well, there's no question about it. The girls were now shaking and they were wiggling. Legs were not bared yet, but they were public. And obviously, breasts could not be far behind. The strip was at hand, as one of our statesmen has put it, and it's sort of the light at the end of the tunnel here. Now, strangely enough, when real nudity came to the stage, it didn't come to the stage in America on the burlesque stage. It came instead in the revues, such revues as the George White Scandals, which ran from 1919 to 1931, the Earl Carroll Vanities, 1923 to 1931, and the Ziegfeld Follies, which were off and on between 1907 and 1960. Again, these were primarily the living model kind of thing, or at least the girls would simply walk on stage and they were nude, certainly from the waist on up. But while the revues were doing this sort of thing, beginning to get raunchier and beginning to bring more nudity to the stage, strangely enough, burlesque got very, very self-righteous and began to clean itself up. Its shows got extremely pretentious, trite, mediocre, and certainly unexciting by show business standards. And of course, there was always the old joke about what's going on backstage between the comics and so on. And at that time, it said that the joke was that not much was going on backstage and not much was going on stage either, as far as that was concerned. In the meantime, the revues got dirtier, they got nuder, they got glossier, and they began to get more customers, including the females. The revues had parades and living statues of bare-breasted women, while burlesque played to empty houses. By 1925, burlesque came to its senses and realized that the age of clean burlesque was over. And the shimmy came back, and bare breasts became standard. And I have a quote here from Irving Zeidman, a very great book called The American Burlesque Show, in which he describes some of the burlesque at about the year 1925. Frenzy of congregate cooching, such as had never seen before on the public stage. The chorus girls on the runway, yelling, shimmying directly at or over the men. The music blatant, jangling, and dissonant. The audience alternately hooting or derisively encouraging. It was a dominical, orgiastic spectacle. Hands upraised to merciful heaven, the girls would sprawl out on the runway, twist, writhe, squirm, and shake, each to her own inventive, obscene devices. They were led by a soubrette, not nearly as ugly, but usually fatter and neuter, who, after exhorting her charges to better their efforts, proceeded to exceed them with all her own bodily convulsions, paying particular attention, as befitted her superior rank, to the toughs in the boxes, who she beguiled with postures of unmistakable meaning. They shimmied off the runway onto the wings, but kept coming back for encores as long as the applause lasted. Fat, lean, scrawny, pockmarked, haggard, and aged, fleshy thighs bulging from skin tights splashed with dirty runway dirt, They lived on Varicose Alley, the runway on which they dispassionately jiggled their breasts and compressed their buttocks. It was a fetid sight, harrowing and debasing, yet at times possessed of haunting frenzy. And Variety, in their usual very concise manner, called it a glorification of the shovel and the American cow. It was quite obvious these were gross imitations of the Broadway revues, but they brought in the crowds. Now, there was one thing, however, although burlesque was imitating the revues, there was one thing that was invented in burlesque, quite obviously, and that is the principal topic of this afternoon, the strip. Where did the first strip occur? Well, there are as many theories as there are theorists on this particular matter. An acquaintance of mine, an A. Owen Aldridge from the University of Illinois, who is writing a history of strip, claims that he has seen a plaque in London at the Raymond Review Bar, which claims that a MoMA first stripped there on February 9th, 1983. Others feel that perhaps it was Anne Held in 1908 or 1909 in L.A., who disrobed behind a screen, and then she would flip her clothes over the top of the screen to the music, "I'd like to see a little more of you." In San Francisco in 1913, there was a Maisie who undressed behind a white shadow graph so that her silhouette was cast. And then there was also in Pittsburgh in 1915, Mademoiselle de Leon, who stripped to tights and a leotard. According to Anne Corio, the real modern strip was really an accident that occurred in 1928 when a Hindu Wausau was trying to get into her clothes, and she had to get out on stage rather quickly, and she started to do her shimmy, and parts of her anatomy flipped out, and it just brought down the house. Who knows where it all started? There she is. That's Hinda Wausau. There is one thing that she did invent, and that is she invented the self-caress, which is, this kind of thing. It's very much part of the strip. Well, probably the ultimate in tease occurred the first year, that same year, 1928, with a Carrie Fennell in Cleveland, of all places, where else, where in order to keep her job, she removed one additional garment each week, and she lasted 52 weeks. The one thing about Carrie Fennell is that she also invented one of the real aspects of the striptease that was to stay for a number of years, and that is tassel twirling. Tassel twirling is the art, in quotes here, you have the tassels on the breasts hanging down, and depending on your particular talent, most girls can go this way, some girls can go like that, other girls can go like that. If you've never, you've got to see it to believe it, but it was an integral part of burlesque for many, many years, tassel twirling. And then, of course, I'm not kidding you, I'm telling you, this is straight, this is science here. There were tassels also attached to the derriere, and the real good girl could get all four things going at once in different directions. Just a miraculous sight. Well, there was no question that striptease saved burlesque from going under, as far as the reviews were concerned. After 1928, the tights, the leotard strip disappeared. Stripping became burlesque's main attraction. And oddly enough, just at a time when really most of the other parts of burlesque, the humor and so on, began to go under, was the same time when stripping itself entered into its golden age with such stars as Anne Corio here, for example. Now, when we talk about Anne Corio, we're talking about the real artistes. We're talking about the girls who really were at the pinnacle of this whole mountain of jiggling flesh that constitutes the strippers throughout the ages. Ann Corio, here seen, I think she's about 18 there. She started when she was 16. It has been said of her that nobody took off so few clothes and took so long to do it for so much. Hers was not any kind of an act that was vulgar in any sense at all. It was very slow, very sophisticated, and she really brought down the house. Another one up in the same ranks with Ann Corio is Gypsy Rose Lee. Gypsy was also one of the great strippers of all times, and she was to later to become a relatively successful author of the book entitled The G-String Murders, and of course Gypsy, which was made into a stage play and then later into a movie. But despite the classiness of some of the people, such as Ann Corio and Gypsy Rose Lee, these were really the exceptions to the art. By 1930, burlesque was simply a repetitious strip show. At one time, the nudity glimpses had been something that was left until last, and now they were the most prominent aspects of the show. Some of the notion of the idea that burlesque was going was indicated by the presence of the candy butcher. Now, the candy butcher, again, is an American phenomenon, a phenomenon of the burlesque. This is the guy who stands up there between the acts and tries to sell candy, usually an overgrown slob who is telling you about all the goodies in the candy boxes. For example, he's saying we're selling these Cracker Jack boxes, and in one of these boxes, ladies and gentlemen, there is a genuine Bulova watch, and so on. But anyway, also one of the things that the candy butchers were selling were French postcards and a mirror, of course, that if you blew on it, you could see all kinds of things. Usually what you saw on it was a sucker looking back at you, was actually what you saw. By 1931, Bill Minsky began to dirty up burlesque. The girls began to grind. They began to grind on the floor. This was a new aspect of it, for the girls to get on the floor and strip tease. And finally, the panties started to come off, revealing a G-string, and then finally, the G-string also began to disappear. Well, it was only, it was inevitable. It was just simply a matter of time when the censors began to move in, and particularly in the area in New York City and Pittsburgh, almost in any of the major cities across the United States. But poor burlesque was caught in a dilemma. As soon as they started tidying up their shows, they lost customers. As soon as they started dirtying them up, then the censors began breathing down their neck. Mayor LaGuardia in New York didn't want to close the burlesque houses, simply because he realized how many people would throw out of work. But he had to, as far as he was concerned. By 1937, he called burlesque incorporated filth, and he closed the theaters. They reopened, but then they were finally banished in 1939. In 1942, the appeal went all the way to the Supreme Court, and New York City's ban was supported there when Justice Aaron Levy called burlesque inartistic filth. So you got incorporated filth on one hand and inartistic filth on the other hand. It all comes out to the same thing. After World War II, there was a brief resurgence of burlesque, but the great stars had left it or they had grown old. And burlesque responded not by trying to insert new material, trying to get better comics or something of this type, but instead began to pile on the strippers, and they began to get stronger and stronger material. Now, the big names in burlesque, such as Gypsy Rose Lee, she had gone off to the Ziegfeld Follies or off into her own business. And Corio, too, was beginning into her declining years and was thinking of doing other things. So we do have some great names, and I brought along some pictures for those older people in the audience who want to look back and relive those old memories. There she is, Lily St. Cyr. Now, Lily was probably one of the first girls to work the notion of a gimmick. You see, Gypsy and Ann Corio really didn't have much of a gimmick. They took off their clothes in a very dignified and rather seductive manner. Lily St. Cyr, on the other hand, took a bath in an illuminated bathtub, transparent one, and so she was sort of the first of the gimmick girls. There were others with gimmicks, and this became sort of a standby for burlesque. For example, there was a Moonbeam McSwine who had piglets in her act. There's Alma Bray, who did her act on a trapeze. She stripped on a trapeze, and I must admit I've never seen it, but my understanding is she supported herself by her breasts on the trapeze. A remarkable act, I'm sure. There was Princess Pepper, who swallowed fire. There was Jean Jamaz, who danced with the devil. There was Madeleine de la Rue, who danced with a dummy gorilla. And finally, the girl with probably the biggest gimmick of them all, Miss Wow Wow. Miss Wow Wow, her billing said that she was 58, 24, 36. Now, I've seen Miss Wow Wow myself, and she is nowhere near 58, just closer to 50. I mean, just an extreme exaggeration there. Your lake out here reminds me of the story of a stripper by the name of Boom Boom Laverne. It's an apocryphal tale, but my understanding is that Boom Boom hit one of the musicians with his own trumpet when he insisted on calling her Bang Bang Latrine. But it was the age of the strong acts, and here's one of the strongest, Rose LaRose. Certainly a very, very successful stripper, the first to earn $2,000 a week, $2,000, gang, count it. She was definitely not very subtle. She was a bump and grinder. But she bumped and grind enough so that she was finally able to do very well. She, of course, bought the, I guess it was the old town theater in Toledo, which is now the Esquire. Rose just died here a couple of months back. But despite people like Rose LaRose, burlesque was dying in the theaters. The stripping began to spread out. It began to spread out to the nightclubs and, for example, into places like the Block, where Blaze Starr performed. There's Blaze Starr. I'll have to read to you a description of Blaze's act, which was described in Esquire magazine in July of 1964. To give you some idea here of how far things had come. The curtain parted, revealing a long red couch, 3 electric candles on a small table, and a lamppost marked Passion Street. The band played Pomp and Circumstance. A customer shouted, "Go, girl, go," and Blaze entered. She wore a wrap and a gown that she had made herself out of real leopard skin. On her gown, the leopard in front reached around the back so his paws grabbed her at the buttocks. In one hand, Blaze held a long cigarette holder trimmed in leopard. She smiled until the applause died down, and then to a stripper's version of Night Train, she dragged her cape around the runway. She switched on the electric candles and began mincing up the runway sans cape and holder, but now with a rose, which was her trademark, between her teeth. She bit off a mouthful of petals and tossed the stem and pistol to a deaf mute who was in the audience. She then bared one bulging breast and used it as a launching pad, flicking rose petals to a middle-aged barber with glazed eyeballs. Blaze tripped up to the microphone. Looking down at her exposed breast, she said, "What are you doing out there, you gorgeous thing?" She then covered herself. "You've got to tell them that they're pretty. It makes them grow." The drummer whacked a cymbal, and the boys laughed. "Strip already," yelled a youth. The youth wore a red and white shirt with a black collar and an arm patch identifying him as a winner of the National Duck Pin Bowling Congress Triplicate Award. "You evil little old tomcat," Blaze said, and threw her pelvis at him. Now, if I know the strip joints, there was another cymbal clash right there. She then flung herself on the couch and quickly stripped down to a transparent bra and black garter pants. She produced a powder puff and asked rhetorically, "Who's going to powder my butt?" To the tune of "That's My Desire," a volunteer leaned over the bar and did it. Another was allowed to dust her breasts, and a third received permission to peel off her pants. "You're fogging my glasses," he said. Blaze replied, "Oh, suffer." She returned to the microphone and shook out her pants, and powder flew. "That's not dust, it's rust." On the couch again, Blaze removed her bra, caressed herself, leaned over pendulously, and shouted, "Lunchtime." Then she lay flat, undulating, pushed a secret button so that chemical smoke began to rise between her legs, and shreds of red cloth stood on end, rippling like fire. It's quite obvious we've come a long way since the Black Crook, right? Strip was essentially bump and grind, and I can't display bump and grind for you, and I'm not going to even try. But anyway, here are just some quick scenes of some of the modern day nameless strippers. I don't know who they are. Give you some idea of the way they dress. There's one taking off her outer garments. There's one now. She's down to their G-string, and she's got a slight bra on there. And finally, there is the bump and the grind, and I don't know whether she's bumping or grinding, but it really doesn't make any difference, I guess. Well, old burlesque today can only be found in two places that I'm aware of, and one of them is Ann Corio's This Was Burlesque, which is a traveling tent show. I don't know if it gets into this area or not. And Harold Minsky in Las Vegas has one which is a sort of a year-round show. As I said earlier, the origin of strip can only be understood in the context of burlesque. It was born there. Burlesque was a legitimate branch of show business. It was the lowest, but possibly one that was really the closest to the people, certainly closest to the common working man. Sort of the poor man's musical, the poor man's Ziegfeld Follies, his clubhouse. And according to Bernard Sobol, certainly one of the great students of burlesque, he felt that burlesque, early burlesque at least, was a school for the vicarious sowing of wild oats, the place where you sort of learn the facts of life in a way only through entertainment. And it certainly was a proving ground of some of the great entertainment that we know today. Now, until just 40 years ago, burlesque was essentially satire, farce, and humor. And it was a school for many, many comics that you know of have gone through burlesque, and just to name a few of them. Skelton, W.C. Fields, Lenny Bruce, Ed Wynn, Buster Keaton, George Jessel, and the list could go on. But the thing is that the good comics left burlesque. They didn't stay there. The humor was tinged with sex, and it was sort of, the burlesque was a combination, really, of the sort of two universals, I think. That is humor and sex. Now, burlesque was never intellectual theater. It was never intended to be. It was a spectacular which the common man could presumably enjoy and not be overburdened too much with symbolism. It was terse, lively, and a joyful thing. But with the sex emphasis grew a great deal of seriousness. Now, some people, like Sobel, have tended to romanticize burlesque. They said its vulgarity was doing what comes naturally. It was a wondrous experience in sex, an experience to anticipate, realize, remember, and enjoy again. But he got very unhappy, said it lost its joy. Freudian psychology, with its gutter concentrations on homosexuality, bisexuality, hermaphroditism, and other, quote, clinical complications, killed it. And he really bemoaned the loss of innocence, and he felt that really stripping had killed burlesque. But more realistically, I believe that burlesque was a victim of its times and its changing morals and the changing tastes. The comics, the dancers would have gone the way vaudeville went anyway. Burlesque comedy just was a stultifying thing because it really never changed. Even if you go to people like, even some of the late burlesque when it was still in the theaters. It never really changed. And I'm not sure sometimes the comedy was that funny anyway. You know, you've heard the old Weber and Fields thing. Who was that lady I saw you out with last night? You know, that was no lady, that was my wife. That came out of burlesque. And I'm not sure it got many laughs the first time. But not too many years after that and years that followed, you know, you get such exchanges as, what's the difference between mashed potatoes and pea soup? And the response is, well, you can mash potatoes, but you can't, you know. And it really never came up to the brilliance that probably could have. It really, stripping kept burlesque alive. It should have, it was kept alive well past the time when the corpse should have been respectfully interred to forestall the odor. Rose LaRose commented, she said, burlesque is more than girl stripping. It is beautiful costumes, comics, production numbers, and much more. But this is really not true, you see. Stripping had become a savior of burlesque, and when the sight of a girl's legs was no longer a rarity, other parts of the anatomy had to be exposed. And burlesque essentially became stripped to its quiescence, and its quiescence was girls, and girls is the only commodity. And the girls finally themselves had to be stripped to their physical quiescence. Now, Ann Corio said that on stage I try to do just what I do in my own bedroom. And then she went on, she said that the original assumption of strip was the power of sex is the power of suggestion. And she said to use the man's imagination. Take a glove off in the right manner and a man will ask you to marry him, is the way she put it. Well, this is kind of simplistic. I'm not even sure she was serious at that time. There's no question that there's an art to taking off one's clothes, and all you have to do is watch some of the better strippers do it, and I think you'd all agree. But on the other hand, I would also argue there's an art to eating pig's feet, too. But the point is, who cares, see? And I think the point has probably been reached today in America in which people really don't care. Stripping lingered because it was able to keep pace for a long time with the development and changes in the world of fashion and the world of morality, the outside. It could match the well-turned ankle on the street, which was a big thing the boys used to stand around looking for in the 1900s. It could match that very easily with a full-length leg, you know, closed in tights to be sure, but a leg. And then when the leg came into vogue, then burlesque had come along with the bare breast. But a stripper, no matter how good the stripper is, she's just got so many parts. And finally, the ubiquitous nudity was such that it had really lost a lot of its audience, the audience that had in fact come there for the humor and the extravaganza and so on, and it had to try to keep that audience strictly by sexual means, and it simply could not compete with the world as it changed here, particularly after the Second World War. When you began to get on the silver screen sort of the world of beavers, and I'm not going to explain beavers for you, all I'll say is that it was simply not referring to Walt Disney Productions. What you got was sort of a gynecological phantasmagoria, which erupted on the screen at many of your local theaters. And finally, even these scenes, changed to scenes of intercourse and sadism and any other sort of sexual goings-on that you may care to watch. There's no way that burlesque could have ever competed with something like Deep Throat or with Mona, in case you're familiar with those movies. The strip offers only sex, and it never offered anything else, no matter how pompous or how pious the interpretations are that you want to put to it. The strip simply ceased to have a monopoly on sex, and when it did so, it simply died. Oddly enough, it's kind of interesting that many of the old strippers and the old burlesque people have a very great sense of deep self-righteousness when they talk about what's happening. Sam Cohen, who was the last manager of the last true burlesque in New York City, the Follies Burlesque, said, "Nudity today is nothing big. Burlesque is dying. It's something that's passé and will never come back. I'm so bewildered now. I was on the East Side the other day and I saw a girl in dungarees. They were worn so low in the back that you could actually see her buttocks. My God, what are we coming to, he says here. But the strip is not really through yet. We have it, of course, in some of your local emporiums around here, but it's still a very popular aspect of our popular culture, surprisingly. You don't see it on the burlesque stage, but you do see it in some theaters, and it has never really moved out of the American bedroom, evidently, particularly the American working class bedroom. It's still part of the culture of the bed and the board, and I just want to read to you some of the things that have come from the written word, which obviously are directed at a certain class of people in the United States. And one of the best here is Libby Jones' Striptease, a book on how to strip. And here is her introduction. Libby Jones was a stripper, one of the better ones. Have you ever stood before a mirror to see how provocatively you can take off your clothes, she writes. Have you ever so much bared a shoulder, raised an eyebrow, swung a hip, or batted an eyelash? If you can answer yes to any of these questions, you can surely learn the wonderful art of striptease. It will take a few innate womanly wiles, a bit of bravado, a familiarity with the basic routines, and a sincere desire to be terrifically appealing to some guy. And she goes on, and here are some of the do's or don'ts. I'm just reading this to you so you get some idea that stripping is really not gone. It's a very popular book, by the way. Not exactly selling like Exodus, but it's all right. Don't attempt to strip unless he's in a good mood, she writes. A professional stripper knows she's got eager paying audience. The home artist can't be sure of the receptivity of her audience. Do perform while he's in his street clothes. This will make him more of a spectator audience and to avoid the ho-hum, into my pajamas, end of the day attitude. Don't exaggerate. Be flamboyant. That's the biggest difference between striptease and just plain undressing. Do improvise. A good strip is varied and highly personal. Do know your man and tailor your actions to please him. Of course, he may turn out to be surprisingly out of character. Do keep your eyes on him as much as possible. Such directness carries great impact. Do bring attention to your body with your hands. Let them stop and rest at bust level and glide over your hips, etc. Do allow for a little audience participation. This always gets them. Toss your clothing to him as you shed it. Let him unhook a garter, etc., and always let him know that you're performing for him. Do wear high-heeled shoes, the ones that will be comfortable for you even when you are stockingless. And for heaven's sakes, do wear them all the time. They do so much for a woman's body. Do usher him to a comfortable seat that's equivalent to front row center, and then let him sit back and relax. Do leave his cigarettes and a stiff drink handy. He may need them. Do arrange for music that will last the duration and set the mood you want. There are many strip music records available if you really want the brass tacks atmosphere. And do work on the lighting and so on. Well, that was sort of one example. But there's still other examples, too. When you go into some of the confession magazines, which quite apparently appeal to the working class woman. And here you will see such stories as, to keep your man at home at night, try Wiggles, Wiles, and Black Net Skirt. This comes from True Story. This particular woman explains how she would have various nights. There was an Oriental night for her man. There was an Italian night, a French night with champagne, and a black nightie. And she writes, she says, there's nothing like getting out that black sexy underwear and taking off with your man. There are advertisements. It's your body. Show it. Veil it alluringly in John Chassel's sheer pink Parnasse ensemble. Chiffon peignoir with bikini panty. So very French, exclamation point. Other advertisements. Princess Flavine and Paul Valentine, America's foremost designers and manufacturers and distributors of boudoir glamour garments, proudly present a line of seductive play clothes of fascination, revelation, and temptation. There's the Mad Love peekaboo bra and panty set of nylon treecoat. There is the Twist, the go-go lingerie for the go-go-go girls who make the whirl around with this peekaboo fun flirting fringe. There's a company called Originals Incorporated, who have the Demi Venus open front bra. There's something called a Smoothie Company. I'm not making these up. The Smoothie Company, which has the harem jammas, inspired by the fashions of the palaces of the Near East. Breathtakingly effective, etc. Then Lily St. Cyr has her line of clothes, too, and for those that really want to go right to the horse's mouth. Be well dressed for that most delightful sport of all, people watching. Make your selections from a choice line of unusual and alluring garments, the bold, the delicious, and the naughty. She has, this is St. Cyr now, French bra, French flip bra, and hip skirt. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but we'll let your imagination. The whiz-bang strip panel, and the tiniest G-string. All of these things you can buy. There's the Pigalle bra, a daring half bra of shimmering satin, giving the bare, busted up and out effect here. And then, of course, there's the old Fredericks of Hollywood. I'm sure you've all heard of them, where his big items are the No Crotch, Mighty Might, and Double Dare, and so on. These are panties, guys, in case all of this is a mystery to you. But then we go from the ridiculous to the sublime. Still another example of the strip in American culture comes from one of my favorite columns, The Worry Clinic, by Dr. George Crane, Ph.D., M.D. Dr. Crane appears in innumerable papers throughout the United States, usually small-town newspapers, and he has almost all kinds of advice for you. I don't care whether you've got cancer, obesity, or sex problems. Since he is Ph.D. and M.D., he's got an answer for everything, including the problems with the capitalistic system or what's happening with our. Anyway, some of his common phrases are, it's the cheesecake in the boudoir instead of the roast beef in the dining room that keeps a husband from straying. And another comment, Helen of Troy launched 1,000 ships, but not because of her roast beef. And he writes, for when the dutiful husband finds his wife so inert and sluggish, he begins to wane in his erotic verve. It is doubly true if his former slender bride is now a fat, unperfumed mate who concentrates on dining room roast beef but ignores a boudoir cheesecake. And here are some, just at random here, case V583 here. Neela J., age 36, is sexually frightened. Dr. Crane, we have 4 children, always felt ours a perfect marriage, etc. Anyway, she feels that her husband is growing platonic to her. She's getting very, very worried. She's a superb cook, however, and Dr. Crane says, I have repeatedly warned you wives that the outside siren does not win your husbands away from you by serving tastier roast beef. No, indeed. She merely dishes out more important, enticing boudoir cheesecake. Neil, I don't know if I can keep a straight face through this or not. Anyway, he says, remember, girls, that although you yourself may feel quite satisfied with your present bedroom menu of erotic calories, your mate may be starving. For virile males crave maybe 4 times the amount of boudoir calories that you actually desire. And then he has these rules. Among them, lose weight, girls, okay? The other thing is feign far more ardor in the boudoir than you normally feel, for the successful wife must function in lieu of a 4-woman harem. And he says, until you regain your former sylph-like co-ed figure, try to neutralize the negative erotic effect of your surplus blubber by using more seductive perfume, plus frilly slips and daphnis nighties. Then there's Janet J., case V532 here. And she wants to know why is it that he suggests daphnis nighties. She's asking a very straightforward question here, I think. Daphnis nighties, he responds, make the bride far more alluring than she appears a la nude. Why? Because frilly, silken clothing makes fetish that men have long cherished regarding a seductive girl. So the more thinly clad female figure is more enticing than the nude body, even at burlesque shows. Aha. It is the act of disrobing that causes the cheers and applause from the male audience. Once the girl has removed the last vestige of her undergarments, she loses the dramatic value of anticipation. Anticipation runs, the adage, is greater than realization. Besides, the competitive spirit of the usual male makes him more eager to approach the partially clad boudoir mate. It's a challenge. And it's the act of disrobing his bride that also triggers that habitual fetish that's thus stimulating his greater ardor. Anyway, he goes on. Anyway, he's simply telling you here again and again. He said, it isn't roast beef in the dining room that holds a man as much as the exciting cheesecake in the boudoir. This is in relationship to another case V517. The paramour may not even be able to fry an egg or perk coffee, he writes, yet she often steals good husbands from wives who win blue ribbons for their cakes and other culinary exhibits at the state fair. So get hep, he writes. That's to show that he's really in the swing of things. Get hep. Men will even eat contentedly out of tin cans and never grumble about frozen TV dinners if you serve more delectable cheesecake in the bedroom. Well, I think I'll just simply close here to say that strip really hasn't died. It's still around us in one form or another. And I suppose it's sort of like my mother told me when my dog died. She said, it's just that stripping or Shep, wherever he hasn't died, he's just simply gone away, you know. And thank you very much. You've been a very attentive audience. I will answer some questions for anyone that, I'll give 5 minutes for those people that want to get the hell out of here, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions.